This is Steve Leone. We're at Intersolar North America 2012 in San Francisco. I'm here with Mark Cerasuolo of Outback Power. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
So Outback Power is a company that's been built on off-grid and lots of applications. Let's talk a little bit about microgrids, and that's something that you're involved with. What's the future of microgrids, and what are some of the applications in which we may see them?
It's good that you mentioned that, Steve, because everybody's pretty much talking about microgrids these days, and much of the world is still either without power or with limited power or with emerging power needs. And microgrids and mini-grids, as they're sometimes called, are applicable everywhere from places like India, where electricity generation is still very expensive on site, and so grids are unstable, unreliable, or inconsistent, to areas in developing countries like parts of Africa, Central and South America, where there are towns that are beginning to put in things like personal electronics, computers, IT infrastructure, libraries, schools, and yet they're a long way away from a grid, and so they have to set up their own grid nearby in that area and wire possibly homes, definitely schools, libraries, other facilities, churches, you name it, up to a small grid. And that's where the growth of microgrids is coming.
Okay, and there's certainly other applications as well, and one of them is the U.S. military is really looking at microgrids as a way to really mitigate a lot of tactical danger that is represented by things like fuel convoys. What's the future in that respect, and how does the industry, become a part of that solution?
Well, I think the statistic I once saw is that the Department of Defense consumes 300,000 barrels of oil a day in running its operations, and that's just doing that off the top of my head, but that's an astonishing figure. And since infantry and armies started moving mechanically as opposed to horseback, fuel has always been the Achilles heel. Getting fuel, delivering fuel, it's stopped entire armies in our history. Well, the modern military recognizes that, and also the danger that convoys put their own troops in, and they simply don't want to risk lives defending diesel fuel moving in convoys. If they can generate power on site, they can set up a microgrid at a forward operating base, for example. That's much better strategically and tactically in the field than trying to bring the fuel in. And so that's what they're doing. We actually have a lot of our own products supporting those kinds of installations where they're used in forward operating bases, running oftentimes wind turbines and almost always solar. We see that in places like Iraq and Afghanistan today, and really in bases all over the world.
So what are the challenges here in terms of getting that to be a widely used model instead of kind of where we are now?
Well, one thing is going to be simply education and application. As people are looking at renewable energy as a way to both live greener and save money, which is how people tend to look at it today, the challenge will be in integrating into that and understanding that it also lets you live safer and more reliably. Well, let's look at, for example, the storms on the East Coast just last week. With that ripped through there, knocked out power in D.C. and all these places during a heat wave for long periods of time. And people who had, even people with renewable energy systems, with solar on their roof, for example, were just as hot and were without power just as their neighbors were, because their systems were simply incapable of, they had no battery backup, no backup storage, they were incapable of keeping them powered up. And I think it will be really interesting when the developed world takes a cue from the developing world. I would look at, for example, an office complex that just outfit in India, a tea and rubber plantation, historic building that just outfitted itself with a large Outback inverter and battery system, and it runs an office complex with 45 workers, lighting, IT, and air conditioning, fully air conditioned, all off grid. So the practicality is there, the cost effectiveness is there, the return on investment's there. It's simply a matter of really understanding how the technologies are used and then integrating them more effectively, and I think more cohesively, so that that builders here and renovators here and people planning these structures here can understand that, yeah, in fact, it's entirely possible and in fact desirable to put an office building in the middle of Washington, D.C. or in the middle of New York City that could be off-grid when it needs to be to save money and to potentially save lives during an outage.
We're starting to see a lot of partnerships emerging between the storage end and the solar end. Is that something we're going to see in the next year, a couple of years? Is the two industries moving closer together and forming strategic partnerships?
Oh, absolutely. They need each other because the renewable energy industry, to get past the model of incentives and credits and simple savings to backup power, to being able to manage your consumption, manage your energy use more wisely, will definitely need battery storage or storage technology, and storage technology to become a household item, literally, in something that will be in many garages, will need renewable energy to be widely applicable and get installed in a lot of homes and businesses. So I think the two are going to grow together.
And then, of course, the limitations of the challenge, at least at this point, is on a cost basis. Can you address that a little bit and how that's going to find its way down to greater adoption?
Right. There's always two kind of cost equations. One is the upfront cost, and one is of course the ultimate or long-term cost. In the grid-tied world, people say, depending on the state incentives, taking the federal incentives into account, and taking utility savings, things like that, that you could pencil in between 30% and 40% off the cost of a system over its payback. If you look at the cost of going, say, grid hybrid, both off-grid and grid-tied, depending on when you need it, versus simply grid-tied, you might be looking at for a basic system, 15 to 20% premium, again, depending on where you live, depending on what the incentives are. But then if you look at what that is over the entire payback time of the system, let's take the 8-year figure as kind of a hypothetical average. It's about right for a lot of states. That might work out to something like $600, $700, $800 extra a year for that capability. And then you look at the Insurance Institute's figures and you see that the average limit, a deductible on or limit on a freezer full of food every year is $500, and you start thinking, wow, one freezer full of food a year for 8 years, and my battery backed up system, the battery backed up part of my system and the smarter inverter it needs has basically paid for itself. And you start looking at that and thinking, yeah, well, what's not to like? I'm going to lose it I'd lose it, and this way I keep my freezer full of food, and my ice cream stays hard, and my beer stays cold, and the next time there's a big storm, and life is good. So there it is.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Thanks very much, Steve.